Okay, so today we're going to be talking about some what are called icons of evolution, or just some ideas that were kind of the linchpin of the whole evolutionary concept. One of the big ones that's really come into question recently is this whole concept that humans share 99% of their DNA with chimps, or, some really large percentage. So with further research, they've found that chimpanzees and humans really have nowhere near similar DNA. It's still up probably in the 90s or high 80s if you look at things, but if we're talking high 80s, there's research to show that we have somewhere between 70 and 90% genetic similarity with carrots. So it's not so much that the genetic similarity defines what an organism is, it's that we all live in the same environment and we have mechanisms for doing that. And, just like humans have mitochondria and lysosomes and Golgi bodies and endoplasmic reticulum, so do carrots, so do chimpanzees, so do dogs, so do trees. The basic building blocks, other than the cell walls and the chloroplasts, are the same for all organisms. Cells are essentially the same, whether no matter what organism they're in. So the DNA inside those cells, which first and foremost has to make more cells, is going to be pretty similar because it's making the same organelles that do basically the same thing. There are a few distinctions, and that's why we get some genetic variations, some genetic differences. But overall, yeah, our genes are going to be the same because we're doing the same thing. We're breathing in oxygen. Our cells are going through cellular respiration. We're breathing out carbon dioxide. So we have to have similar tissues to do those processes. Chimps have that. We have that. My dog has that. My cat has that. It's not something that makes us quintessentially the same. And actually, after more study, they've also found some really hard, solid numbers about how the genetics between chimpanzees and humans are very different. For example, a chimpanzee's genome is 12% longer. So while it might have a similar number of chromosomes, although actually it doesn't, it has 23, whereas we have 22 if you don't count the sex chromosomes that just basically determine whether you're going to be a boy or a girl, and the hormones involved in that, sorry. So theirs is 12% longer. So in each genome, where we would have, say, 85 or 88 genes, they're going to have 100. So while we might have, 99% of the same genomes, each of their genomes is going to be 12 genes longer, and that's going to add up to a lot. And then also when you consider that if you take any individual genome and spread it out, I think if you spread out even just the human DNA into like one continuous single line, it's enough to like circle the earth several times. So there's a lot of room for difference, and there's a lot of room for similarities, because again, basically, scientifically, we're all just cells. Now, we don't have genes that code for our humanity. That, I believe, is something that God gives us. And so I don't think you would see that reflected in our DNA, because that's not a DNA process. God made Adam out of the dirt, and he had his form, but he wasn't human until God breathed life into him. What makes us human, I don't think, can be found in our DNA. But anyway, looking at our DNA, there's a 13% difference between our immune system and a chimp's immune system. So we're going to interact with things differently. And there's a 17% difference in our cerebral cortex, which is the main thinking area of our brain. So if you're looking at that, the difference between a cerebral cortex of someone who is, Einstein-level genius and someone who is, completely mentally dysfunctional is less than 17%. Basically, genetically, they're going to have the exact same genes. There might be like a 0.5% difference between Einstein and someone who, is basically non-functioning. And whereas the difference between humans and chimpanzees is 17%. That is huge. That's going to have a huge determining factor on the structure and the function of the cerebral cortex, which means they're going to be inherently processing and storing things differently. They're not going to have the same capacity for thinking that humans do. Another issue that, been brought up is just this whole idea that people don't really want to admit. But in his own book, Charles Darwin, in The Origin of Species, says, now, I'm writing this at such and such a point in time in history, and I'm aware of that. But I know advances are going to be made. Hopefully I've made an advancement here. But if science progresses and we find out that my ideas aren't working out, then you should throw out my whole theory. Because I know science progresses and technology advances, and there could be a time when it's proven that this was a nice idea, but it turns out it was wrong. And if there's any, jump, any type of tissue or organism that can't be explained by this, then the whole theory is wrong. And that's something that he himself said, and I know we talked about that before. And people just don't want to look at it. So basically what's happening is all of these scientific advancements were made in the 19th and 20th century, early 20th century, and then it's just kind of become part of the culture for the late 20th and early 21st century that just everything evolved. And that's just how it is. So, quote-unquote, real scientists are put under a lot of pressure just not to even look for anything religious, and there's a lot of pressure that there's just kind of this feeling that if you are, more of a creation scientist, then you don't belong in the scientific field. I mean, you can do, operation science, but creation scientists are just their whole other thing, and it's not real science. So, in one of the articles, it wasn't that, I think it was no self-respecting paleoanthropologist would say, did humans evolve from apes? The question is, humans evolved from which apes? So, it's just the whole culture is that we're not even looking for anything other than evolutionary answers. And that's just kind of the way things are going. But if you look at them longer and you look at them objectively, you start to see the holes. And hopefully we're getting to a point that we are going to start looking at things objectively and less emotionally and less, honestly, less religion-based, because, evolution is just as much of a religion as creationists. It's just, we have substantiation and resources and things like that to support us, whereas evolutionists don't. So, again, it's really about recognizing a bias, and hopefully that bias is starting to be seen, because there are all sorts of areas, in addition to this DNA sharing that is proven not to be true. It's not 99% that we're sharing, and the percent that we are sharing isn't really, it's not a crucial sharing. There's also this theory of the junk DNA. We have all this extra DNA that we're not using for, I know there was a TV show and someone was trying to rejuvenate himself and his machine went wrong, and so he turned into like this weird scorpion creature, and the explanation for it was, he turned on all the DNA that had been turned off, and so these were all the genetic mutations or all of the evolutionary adaptations that natural selection had shut down, and the DNA is still there, it's just not turned on. Well, that theory that there's just junk DNA waiting to, in some future generation turn everyone into a scorpion, that is also proving not to be true. We'll talk about this a bit more next week, there are things like recessive genes that, you'll skip a few generations and then you'll have a kid with red hair when, it was great-great-grandma who last had red hair. But still, we're not changing from a human to something else. We're just changing the color of their hair. And even something like the color of hair is very, very complex genetically. It's several hundreds of genes that go into determining the color of someone's hair or the color of someone's eyes. It's not as clear-cut as we want to make it seem. So if it's hundreds of genes that determine the color of your hair, it's going to be thousands, millions, possibly billions that are dealing with, higher order thinking or the physiology of our bones so that we have that carrying angle to walk upright. And then again, from my personal view, I don't think that our humanness, our souls, are going to be found in our genes anyway. That came from God when He breathed life into us.